U.S. and Chinese officials are discussing arrangements for the highly anticipated meeting between Presidents Trump and Xi at the G20 in Osaka. Trump has said that Beijing must return to concessions it agreed in earlier talks, but China's Vice Commerce Minister says the aim of the Osaka meeting would be, quote, compromise on both sides. Joining us now is Stephen King, HSBC Senior Economic Advisor and author of A Grave New World. Stephen, great to have you with us on the show.
Nice to be here.
How grave is the world going to look after the meeting this weekend, if it happens?
Well, we can cross our fingers and hope that some kind of deal comes through. But I think it's important to recognise that the trade issue is not the only issue that separates the US from China. So in one sense, it's a symptom of a broader problem. And the underlying big problem, of course, is the fact that China is a rising superpower, the US is the established superpower, and there's a sense of tension between them. I think also the Americans felt 20 years ago maybe that there was a reasonable chance that you'd end up with China perhaps gradually shifting towards a more democratic system of government alongside the economic success they've had. They've continued to enjoy economic success, but they haven't made that shift towards a democracy. And that, I think, has meant that the US now feels more uncomfortable with the relationship than it might have been previously. And it's important to stress this is not specifically a Donald Trump issue. I mean, some people have said this. But I think one thing that unites Congress is a kind of anti-China rhetoric. So this is a difficult issue that I think has got quite a long way to run beyond what happens this weekend.
HSBC CEO John Flint made some really interesting comments on Bloomberg earlier about China. Now, it was in the context of concerns around credit. And he said, look,
yes,
China has the capacity to self-heal. And he pointed to, he didn't use the word miracle, but to the strength of the Chinese economy as well. How big is China's capacity to offset any downside risks from an escalation in this trade war?
Well, the trade war itself is unwelcome. That's clear for all sides. I mean, everyone knows that a trade war is a kind of lose-lose situation. But China does have some opportunities for continued growth, one of which is that people often forget that China is a story of very, very different regional experiences. So if you're in the eastern coastal regions, you've done incredibly well over the last few decades. If you're in some of the inland regions, you're sort of disconnected from the world. You haven't really succeeded in quite the same way. So there's a very big income inequality issue between those regions. Now, Belt and Road, which is something that people see as China connecting itself with other countries in Asia, is also importantly a way of connecting the inland parts of China with the eastern coastal parts of China. And if that connection can be made, capital flows inland, infrastructure begins to improve, and the inland areas become a corridor through to the rest of Asia, then you could quite easily see China carrying on growing quite quickly in the years ahead.
Stephen King, I got good news and then I got really good news. Your book, The Grave New World, was important 2 years ago, 3 years ago. The bad news is it's even more important now, folks, because Stephen King addresses technology. We're all dealing with this. How does your dark side of technology overlay with this trade war?
Well, one obvious point, I guess, is the whole issue of cyber and also just general issues about technology theft and all those kinds of issues that have cropped up. But I think the other issue, which is actually more an issue for the West than anything else, is the sense that technology through social media has actually taken us further away from what we might sort of think of as being the underlying truth. Now, programs like this, of course, try to explore the underlying truth, but when you're on social media, following your friends, you tend to reinforce each other's biases. And that actually is quite difficult for a democracy, because if you can't agree on the underlying truth, then what else can you agree on?
Okay, your leader spoke at our conference today in London, Mr. Flint. What is the underlying bias of the Chinese? What is the HSBC view of what the underlying bias is into these G20 meetings of President Xi and the communist leadership?
Well, the first thing is they can't really afford to lose face. In other words, that they're a superpower themselves. If the Americans tell them this is what we want from you, and it makes a series of demands that the Chinese feel they can't deliver domestically, then that creates automatically a clash. China needs to be able to negotiate a settlement rather than being told what the settlement is going to be. The second thing is, of course, that if the US walks away from some of its global leadership role, I think China is hoping that it can establish a leadership role itself. When you think about some of the international organizations that the Chinese have sponsored, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or even the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, each of those is an organization run by the Chinese or established by the Chinese, which in one sense is an extension or a rival to the Bretton Woods institutions that were created after World War II.